Folks, today is cause for celebration. The day this video drops marks the 34th anniversary of Chris Jericho's wrestling debut. And no matter what you may think of him today, you cannot deny his success in wrestling or the impact of his contributions made to this business. From fresh-faced white meat babyface looking for his next big break to grizzled veteran arguably overstaying his welcome, Chris Jericho has literally done it all in professional wrestling. Through the course of his lengthy career, Jericho's been an underdog, a vanguard, an innovator, and to some, even a pariah. He's been one of my favorites ever since I first became a fan of this crazy industry, constantly defying the doubters and breaking through barriers to be his own man and become one of the all-time greats. One thing you have to give to him is his creativity, his ability to evolve, to generate countless catchphrases and nicknames, some of which have stuck for literal decades by this point. And he's done it all without stepping on anyone's toes or existing common law trademark. Don't think I've forgotten. By 1996, Jericho was already a world-traveled competitor, getting his start in Canada, working his way through Mexico, Germany, and Japan, even having a stint in Smoky Mountain Wrestling alongside Lance Storm. Jericho's biggest break in the United States came courtesy of Paul Heyman and ECW, where he briefly held their television championship. But when Eric Bischoff came calling with intentions of building up the domestic side of his cruiserweight division, Jericho's career reached another major high. In just over 3 years with the company, the self-proclaimed Bad Mama Jamma had become an internet darling, a character fans loved to hate. But a glass ceiling above and a political minefield below had put a limit on just how far he could truly go. So what went right and what went wrong? It's time to break the walls down and examine the WCW run of Christopher Jerikovich. What's that? What do you mean that's not his real name? This chapter of Chris's career begins in the summer of 1996. His first WCW match actually aired after his second, as he took on Mr. JL on an episode of Saturday Night, complete with a botched spelling on the name key. His live debut took place on the preceding episode of Monday Nitro against Alex Wright. From the jump, play-by-play announcer and EVP Eric Bischoff sung the praises of the young lion.
He's an upstanding young man and an outstanding wrestler.
Would you co-sign for a house for this guy?
Ah yes, a hearty endorsement from the Ken doll followed by an immediate burial from Bobby Heenan. Off to a great start. Jericho had the match won when Das Wunderkind got knocked loopy on the guardrail, but the young babyface presented his widest cut of meat by refusing to win via countout, insisting that the match ended a no contest. What a guy!
What a wimp!
Early on, Jericho was like a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed 90s update of a classic rock and roll babyface. Think Shawn Michaels if he hadn't changed his look after splitting from Marty Jannetty. Coming out to one of the lightest and airiest rock tunes imaginable, he did all the things that are practically laughed at today, shouting "come on" to an apathetic crowd and throwing himself into the guardrail during his entrance, waiting for the adoring fans to glom all over him, which took some time for them to figure out. Hey, offering your backup to a bunch of random strangers, that's pretty brave, honestly. If I did that, I would just get drinks poured on me. He made his pay-per-view debut at that year's Fall Brawl, taking on a familiar face in Chris Benoit in one of the night's best matches, albeit in a losing effort. He might have had a vanilla personality, but slowly and surely the fans got more on his side every week. And when I say he was vanilla, I mean it too, because even the New World Order couldn't come up with something to say about him.
We'll take nothing from you. You're a fine athlete. Chris Jericho, you're a fine young athlete.
And you, Chris Jericho, you're a terrific athlete, a fine, upstanding individual. You volunteer at the animal shelter once a week and you pay on the first date. Damn it, I got nothing. For life. Referee Nick Patrick, who at this point was in the pocket of the New World Order, cost Jericho his match against Syxx at Halloween Havoc, and revenge was on Chris's mind. He had gained a manager in Teddy Long, which, wow, really? Jericho and Teddy Long at the tail end of his run in WCW, that's something I never would have pictured ever happening. Just like crazy pairing when you think about it. Like Teddy Long went from Jim Powers to Chris Jericho. Huh. Anyway, the stage was set for a big grudge match at World War III. That's right, Chris Jericho's first real program in the company came against a crooked referee in a match where our hero had one arm tied behind his back.
Be careful here now, one arm.
Oh my goodness! Jericho, super kick!
It's great that Jericho finally had a storyline he could sink his teeth into, but a gimmick match against a referee? That's like debuting for the WWF in your first feuds against Jerry Lawler. Who wants that? After dealing a big Patrick Flop-sized dent in the NWO's armor, 1997 was shaping up to be Chris's biggest year yet. For instance, WCW was still in its partnership with New Japan Pro Wrestling, sending many of their wrestlers overseas from time to time. And that gave the Lionheart a chance to go back to the country where he gained so much of his notoriety. But in doing so, picked up a different kind of notoriety. Even before Wrestle Kingdom was officially a thing, January 4th in the Tokyo Dome was still a big date for New Japan, and Jericho was set to debut as Super Liger, meant to be a rival for the legendary Jushin Liger. Unfortunately, Super Liger's match with Koji Kanemoto was a disaster. In his first book, Jericho described the Liger suit as a body cast, and the mask limited his peripheral vision. Not only could he not move, breathe, or see as well as normal, his opponent didn't seem to be enjoying himself either. The match was laughably bad, literally, and the Super Liger gimmick was abandoned after one showing. But you know what? I would still take that over the Painmaker. Back in WCW, Jericho's work remained solid, though mostly unremarkable. He'd win most of his matches on television against guys like Wright, Jeff Jarrett, and other cruiserweights, but lost to another NWO member in Masahiro Chono at the infamous NWO Sold Out pay-per-view, then again to Eddie Guerrero at Super Brawl for the television, United States Championship. It wasn't until June of '97, nearly 1 year after his debut, when Jericho finally leveled up in WCW. On a special house show called Saturday Nitro, Jericho showed some bravado by challenging the winner of a cruiserweight title match between the champion Syxx and Rey Mysterio Jr. After a hard-fought bout, Syxx secured the victory and Jericho quickly pounced. And in less than a minute, the nice young man capitalized on his fatigued opponent to win his first singles title in WCW to a surprisingly mixed reception. Jericho got a nice bit of shine with the title, as seen in a fantastic match with Ultimo Dragon at Bash at the Beach. Then he spent the next couple of weeks trading the belt back and forth with Alex Wright, dropping the title to him on an episode of Nitro, then regaining it 2 weeks later on Saturday Night. Then he went right into a program with the newly healed Eddie Guerrero over the strap. And in sort of an inverse with what happened during his feud with Wright, Jericho won the first encounter at the final Clash of the Champions, but lost the belt to Guerrero at Fall Brawl a few weeks later. Jericho was doing perfectly fine in the ring and was still a valuable member of the mid-card, but the problem was his character wasn't doing too much to stand out. By the fall of 1997, clean-cut babyfaces were pretty darn passé, as the NWO was too cool for school, making almost every other babyface look silly by comparison. With the New World Order taking up more airtime every week, and with Guerrero and Rey Mysterio being the cruiserweight feud du jour, that left Jericho to become more or less a jobber to the stars. He did pick up an upset victory against Scott Hall on an episode of Nitro, though apparently that had more to do with Hall giving the finger to the bookers than it did with them suddenly having any faith in Chris. And oh yeah, he sure looked strong after that win, didn't he, folks? As the high-profile losses began to mount, there was finally some evolution with his character in the form of post-match tantrums. This began a new trend for Chris. He'd lose his temper, apologize profusely for it, then go right back into it after another loss.
I'm sorry, and it will never happen again.
A few minutes later.
I was lying.
The extra aggression paid off as he found himself back in cruiserweight title contention against Rey Mysterio at Sold Out 1998. Now coming out to the Pearl Jammiest song you ever did hear without it actually being them, Chris beat Rey in a fairly straightforward match to a negative reaction from the fans. And it was here where the worm finally turned.
Don't you boo me! All right, let me give you a reason to boo. Come on!
At last, Jericho embraced the hate, wailing away on Rey's injured leg with Mysterio's own knee brace. Mysterio was written off to address his never-ending knee troubles, and the final touch had been put on Jericho's heel turn that had been building throughout the winter. And now we've arrived at the good part. Jericho's heel turn was just the spark needed to help make everything he did that much more interesting. He managed to pull off being booed without having to put on a black and white t-shirt first, and that alone should count for something. Jericho's dynamic growth as a character continued through the winter and the spring. Gone was the bland, golly gee babyface. In his place was a sardonic and conceited heel, one who called people by the wrong names, who called himself the role model, and who referenced a wide variety of musical acts.
I want you to want me.
Unter Glieben, Glauten, Globen. I am the champion. I most definitely am the Walrus. Goo Goo Gajoob. Everybody, Wang Chung tonight!
His promos were a vast improvement from just months earlier, dripping with an overconfidence befitting the character's god complex. In very short order, it was obvious to anyone watching that Jericho was enjoying this new direction, and the more he leaned into the ridiculous nature of the character, the more fans booed him. At the same time, it was impossible not to get a kick out of his snarky heel antics.
You're way over the 225-pound weight limit, unlike myself, a svelte 224 3/4. I grew up on the mean streets of Calgary, Alberta, Canada.
Last night I was in bed wearing my cruiserweight belt, of course.
Wait a minute, we're on the air here.
I was sleeping. Get your mind out of the gutter, old man.
You took my belt, you took my tights, and I'll tell you something else, my Loverboy tape is missing as well. I know you're digging the Mahi Mahi.
Eat Mahi Mahi!
Jericho's next target came in the form of Juventud Guerrera. The champion refused to defend his title against Juventud for weeks until Juvi finally agreed to put his mask on the line at Super Brawl 8. After another competitive matchup, Jericho won the day with the Lion Tamer, forcing the Juice to unmask and reveal, "Oh, be still my heart, that's what he looks like under the mask? Why didn't they do that for him sooner? I declare." As the weeks went on, Jericho would collect figurative and literal trophies of his conquests, from Ray Ray's knee brace, to Juvi's mask, to Disco Inferno's headband, to Dean Malenko's very soul. Well, not literally, but can you imagine? That'd be a weird turn.
Where does Dean Malenko go from here?
Home.
Shortly before Super Brawl, Jericho had defeated Dean Malenko by submission, and much like he did with Juvi, refused to grant him a rematch, even going so far as to put newcomer Lenny Lane under Juvi's mask and pose as Jericho to face Malenko. Finally, at Uncensored, Jericho was forced to defend his title against Malenko, and once again, Jericho came out on top after making Dino submit to the Lion Tamer. Disgusted after losing 4 straight singles matches on pay-per-view, Malenko apparently called it quits on the spot. Jericho used Malenko's surrender as fuel to gloat endlessly over the next few months. From talking to a picture of Dean to making light of Dean's late father Boris, it was almost to the point that he was feuding with a non-existent opponent. Then on the March 30th edition of Nitro, Jericho had one of the most absurd, hilarious, and memorable victory laps of all time.
Malenko, you claim to be the man of 1,000 holds, but I counted, and you know about 60, but I know 1,004. And I wrote them all down. Here we go.
It's the famous Man of 1,004 Holds promo, in which Jericho produced a massive roll of printer paper and began to read off all the wrestling moves and holds he could do. Just a few more than Dean Malenko, of course. It even went through an entire commercial break.
Hold number 712. Arm bar.
Actually, you know what? My eyesight's not too good these days. Is that a list of Jericho's moves in 1998, or the number of gimmicks he would have by 2024?
You just made the list!
Sick of Jericho's shenanigans, WCW Commissioner J.J. Dillon scheduled a #1 contender Cruiserweight Battle Royal for Slamboree, with the winner challenging Jericho for the title immediately following. Jericho introduced the competitors in his customary way.
From selling chimichangas on the streets to WCW, Ciclope! He's the scourge of the illustrious Guerrero family. He is Chavo Guerrero Jr. Damien, he can't afford a mask. He's using paint. The winner of the Lou Ferrigno lookalike contest. This guy is Silver King. If he wins 12 more matches, he'll be upgraded to Golden King.
In one of the best payoffs in latter-era WCW, the match came down to Guerrera and a masked luchador named Ciclope, and after a brief moment, Juvi eliminated himself from the match. To the thrill of the fans and the horror of Jericho, Ciclope unmasked to reveal... The crowd in Worcester came unglued as the Iceman finally got his mitts on Jericho after weeks of trash talk. And before long, Malenko beat the master of the three-handled family Gradunza for his 4th Cruiserweight title. Incensed that he was finally outsmarted, Jericho went on a month-long crusade for justice, claiming to be the victim of a massive company-wide conspiracy. He even went to Washington, D.C. to take his case all the way to the federal government.
Sorry, there's no clearance. You're going to have to leave right now.
But I'm Chris Jericho.
I don't care. You're going to have to leave right now.
Thank you, sir.
He took the mask off, surprised me, and he beat me for the belt. Where's the section on WCW title belts?
I'm gonna give you evidence. I came all the way to Washington, D.C.
Hang on. Can we zoom out on that video real quick?
to get the jurisprudence.
Oh my God, he's going to storm the Capitol. You know what? I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to go there. Not worth the headache. Mr. Jericho's time in Washington was another classic moment, easily the most unique screen time given to a cruiserweight in the entire history of the division. On a June episode of Thunder, Malenko got so sick of Jericho's whining, he simply vacated the title in order to get Chris back in the ring at the Great American Bash.
Thank you, thank you. I'm pretty proud of that one. It's one of my finest achievements.
And so at the Gab, the official return match took place. In the end, Jericho did a little too much dead dad disparagement, causing Dean to snap and lose control, getting himself disqualified and allowing Jericho to regain the championship on a technicality. You think this would perhaps lead to some sort of no DQ showdown between the two, but nope. Instead, Malenko was suspended for his actions, and Jericho pivoted to his old rival in Rey Mysterio Jr. The two fought at Bash at the Beach, with Malenko getting involved and costing Jericho the belt. But the following night on Nitro, Jericho once again proved why he got his nickname, the King of the Loopholes.
In the event of a wrestler being suspended, he must not be present at the event. And if he is present and affects the outcome of said match, the decision of the aforementioned match is null and void. You tell Ron Mysterio Jr. to give me my belt back!
In doing this, Jericho proved he was not only smarter than Rey Mysterio, but also J.J. Dillon. You know, the guy who's supposed to know all this stuff.
Do you know what it says on page 257 of said WCW rulebook?
I don't know that particular page off the top of my head.
Malenko was eventually awarded another match against Jericho later that month on Nitro, under the stipulation that if he lost, he would never be allowed to challenge Jericho for the title again. And once again, the heel got the better of the face as Malenko lost his temper, throwing down the referee and getting himself DQ'd. Well, who wants a satisfying conclusion anyway? You know, those things are just ratings killers. Malenko would get his revenge on Jericho, in a sense, at Road Wild that August. Dean was the guest referee for Chris's title match against Juventud, and despite every one of Jericho's attempts to get himself disqualified, he refrained from throwing the match out, but did lend a slight assist in Guerrero winning the title. So, Jericho injures Rey, humiliates Dean, puts them both out of wrestling for months, and in the end he loses the belt to Juvi? That'd be like if Sting lost to Hogan at Starrcade 97, but then helped out Lex Luger in beating him. You know, sometimes I feel like WCW tried to go out of business on purpose. Jericho was bound and determined to break the glass ceiling in WCW, convoluted booking aside. The night after Road Wild, Jericho won another championship when he beat Stevie Ray for the World Television title, thanks to some help from the Giant. And for the next several weeks, the big man would continue to help the role model to no real conclusion. Apparently the original idea was for the Giant to become Chris's bodyguard, but ultimately that went nowhere, and we wouldn't get this unstoppable union for another 11 years or so. But big picture, can you imagine if that happened back then? You'd have Chris Jericho as part of the NWO. Ugh, no thank you. Him joining the Alliance in 2001 would have made more sense. But Jericho winning the gold was just the beginning. If he could tell a captivating story on the cruiserweight level with one guy with the personality of unbuttered toast, imagine what he could do with a star of a larger caliber, somebody with the personality of slightly better toast. As Fall Brawl 98 began, Jericho came out and demanded a title versus title match with WCW champion Bill Goldberg, who wasn't even booked on the show, though he did appear on the VHS cover. When it was time for the bell to ring, Jericho famously came out mocking Goldberg's security-laden intro and his walk to the ring, complete with some sad-looking pyro. When it finally came time for Da Man to make da entrance, well, it was a great piece of comedic heel work, one of the biggest bright spots on an otherwise dismal pay-per-view, even if it was a bait and switch. Jericho handily defeated the fake Goldberg and spent the next several weeks gloating about a fictional win streak of his own. Based on how the storyline was progressing, Jericho was just asking for an ass-kicking from the unbeaten world's champion. There was just one tiny problem. See, there was an important party to all this silliness who had no intent of playing along. Apparently Goldberg wanted no part in a program with a lowly cruiserweight and let Jericho know about it, even if it was all designed for him to look good in the end by squashing the loudmouth heel. He didn't seem to have a problem showing up in promo segments to beat up Chris and his crack security team, but heaven forbid they have an actual match. I guess having a nothing contest with Brad Armstrong at Super Brawl back in February was more worth his time. The parody at Fall Brawl was hilarious, but also emblematic of several issues with WCW at this time. They not only cheated the fans, who were already starting to make the jump to the WWF, they were also denying themselves the chance to create another star in Jericho. Obviously, he wasn't going to actually beat Berg here, but damn, at least put some stock in your younger guys. In fairness, this storyline did end up creating one new star, Ralphus, Jericho's weird old security guard. Seriously, this guy got over in a way that Jameson could only dream about. He even wrestled twice on pay-per-view, for goodness sake. At this point, Jericho had realized that trying to wade through the political muck in WCW was a fool's errand, and he was beginning to look for a way out. He and Eric Bischoff had verbally agreed to a new contract, but ink had not been put to paper, and Jericho was putting it off. At the same time, Chris reached out to Vince Russo and arranged a secret meeting with Vince McMahon and the rest of the Federation Brain Trust. Meanwhile, compared to what he did as Cruiserweight Champion, his time as TV Champion post-Greenberg was rather uninspired, as he took on guys like Raven at Halloween Havoc and Bobby Duncum Jr. at World War III.
But this is the big leagues, Duncan. This is the big time.
Duncum.
What?
Duncum.
Duncum.
Things picked up at the end of November when Konnan upset Jericho for the TV title on Nitro. In true Jericho fashion, Mr. Mamma Jamma had every excuse in the book for why he lost, complete with visual aids.
He took my head and he hit my head right into the championship belt, and out I went.
Can someone drop a net on these three clowns and get them out of here?
Konnan retained the title in their rematch at Starrcade, and the end seemed near for Jericho's time in the company. His final rivalry in WCW was against Perry Saturn. After a series of losses by Saturn, thanks in large part to crooked referee Scott Dickinson, Jericho accused Perry of whining like a schoolgirl, which led to a loser wears a dress for 90 days match at Sold Out. Jericho won the match with even more blatant help from the referee, because that's what WCW needed in 1999, forcing Saturn to put on the controversial garment. But in reality, it was Saturn who suggested the stipulation in the first place, as he hoped to adopt a more androgynous in-ring persona, not unlike musical acts of the time like Marilyn Manson. The two had a rematch the following month at Super Brawl, with the same stakes as before. Also, Ralphus is wearing a dress now for some reason, but at least the earrings helped complete the look. The match ended when Saturn took out everybody in his way, including Dickinson, only for him to walk off and take a count-out loss, further protecting Jericho while embracing his new look. The feud reached its conclusion at Uncensored in March, when Saturn finally got his revenge and an actual victory in a dog collar match. Jericho's last televised match took place on the April 5th, 1999 edition of Nitro, when he lost a U.S. title tournament semifinal to Booker T before his WCW deal finally expired. The Ayatollah of Rock and Roll would make his WWF debut in August of that year, and the rest, as they say, is history. When you get down to it, Chris Jericho in WCW is but a small example of the company's overall slow degradation. A lot of the big beats I talk about in this story could easily have applied to guys like Chris Benoit, Booker T, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio. The list goes on and on. It wasn't just a Jericho thing, it was a company-wide inability to invest in their future. Jericho absolutely struck gold with his heel persona, creating tons of memorable moments and catchphrases. In all honesty, his run in '98 is the genesis of why I and so many others have been fans of his for all these years. But in a way, it was a double-edged sword. Because he was so funny and entertaining, it was hard to take him seriously, even though he won most of his matches cleanly. Above all else, it was the two-tiered system in WCW that led to a stagnation in his growth, which is why he leapt off the sinking ship in the first place. Obviously, we know that Jericho's career turned out fine. Once he jumped to the WWF, he'd go on to become the champion and megastar he knew he could be, to the point where an entirely new company was built around him 20 years later. But it's interesting to think about how different the wrestling landscape might be today had things worked out just a bit differently for Jericho in World Championship Wrestling. I mean, think about it. Some alternate timeline where WCW never went out of business and kept on thriving, and Chris Jericho stuck around there and got everything he wanted. After a lot of years there and some moments of brilliance, I mean, he would probably eventually turn into a long-standing, tenured veteran who people eventually got sick of. His jokes weren't really hitting the way they used to, and people would get really wearing thin on people to the point where they would chant at him to please retire. But come on. That's Chris Jericho. That would never happen to him. Right?